All right, AMP1 students, in this video we are going to continue to talk a little bit more about gross anatomy. So the next topic in our objectives is to talk about the blood vessels and the nerves that are associated with our bones. And then we'll also talk about the bone marrow and the two types of bone marrow that we have in our medullary cavity. So we'll go back to our picture here. This is a nice picture, I think, to show the blood vessels that are within our bones. So our bones are they call it vascular. So vascular is a term that refers to blood vessels. And so there is a rich supply or a large amount of blood vessels in our bones. And remember when we were looking at the gross anatomy of a long bone, we had that little nutrient foramen, that little hole in the bone. And that's where blood vessels will take blood into our bones. And of course, this little blood vessel here would be connected to these blood vessels that are running through the medullary cavity and up into the spongy bone as well. So that's how our blood gets into the bones, is through a blood vessel that's passing through a nutrient foramen. And the purpose of that is we'll talk about the microscopic anatomy next, but in this tissue here, the compact bone tissue and also the spongy bone tissue, we have living cells in there. So they can be called, there's different types, but there's osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteoclasts. So all of those need nutrients and oxygen from the blood. And then they'll also need their waste products removed too. So then, so whenever nutrients and oxygens, they'll come into our bones through arteries. That's what the red vessels are indicating, arteries. And then once the arteries, the blood in the arteries, leaves the oxygen and nutrients for the bone cells, the osteocytes, then the blood will have less oxygen, so they kind of draw it a blue color. And that blood will then leave the bone, and generally it'll pass, they don't show it, but then generally it'll pass through the bone through another nutrient foramen. So that's how the blood leaves, and what it's doing is carrying away waste products that the bone cells don't need anymore. So that's the general function of the blood vessels. And so it's good to know. We'll talk about this as we've talked about it with the integumentary system. We talked about how the epidermis didn't have blood vessels within it, so it was able to get nutrients and oxygen from the blood vessels that were in the dermis. So we generally, each body system and tissue and organ we talk about the blood supply, because obviously it's very important for the health of the tissue. So, and we will talk, especially in this chapter, we'll talk about a tissue that's part of the skeletal system that actually doesn't have blood vessels. So, okay, so that was our general function of the blood vessels within our bones. So it's going to take nutrients and oxygen to our cells and remove any sort of waste products. The other thing that we need to be, and they don't show it in the picture, unfortunately, but be familiar with, is that our bone has many sensory receptors or nerves. So just like our integumentary system, we had all those little sensory receptors, they called them tactile cells, in the dermis, and then extending up, right there to the top of the dermis near the epidermis. So that was a very sensory organ. So our bone tissue and our bones are very sensory as well. So there is nerves, they call them sensory nerves, because generally they're going to give a signal if something happens to that bone, like it gets injured or something. And then they'll send a signal to the brain and spinal cord. And they don't show it on here, but the nerves would get into the bone through the nutrient foramen as well. They kind of pass through it with the blood vessels, but unfortunately they don't represent those on here. But just realize that our bone tissue is also very, I shouldn't say very, has a large amount of nerves too, and they're mainly sensory nerves. So that's why when we break a bone, if anybody's broken a bone, most people know that that hurts. And the reason is when you do break a bone, you are activating those sensory nerves, and they're sending that pain signal to your brain and spinal cord. So that's why it's pretty painful to break or fracture a bone. So, all right. So the last thing we'll talk about with gross anatomy, now that we understand the nerves and blood vessels and their role, is the red marrow and the yellow marrow. So I'm going to go down here because I think they have a picture of this. Pretty nice picture. Well, yeah, that's pretty good. So they show two types of marrow. So we're talking about the connective tissue of bone that's running in those spaces, like between the spongy bone and also in that medullary cavity. So we're talking about that tissue that's in there. So they call that bone marrow. And we actually have two types of bone marrow, which, I don't know if many people are aware of that, but we have red bone marrow, and it's called red because it actually kind of has this red color to it. And the thing that gives it its red color is because that's where all those blood cells are being produced. So like the red comes from the hemoglobin that's in the red blood cells. Remember, hemoglobin is a pigment, and so if it's present, then usually things look more pinkish or red. So the red bone marrow is the part of the marrow, or the type of marrow, that has a large number of these blood cells forming in there, and so it's got that red color. And then the yellow bone marrow is given that name because it does look yellow, and the reason that it looks yellow is it's primarily composed of adipose tissue, so like the fatty cells that are in there. So I think that's down here. Yeah. So that's, so that gives you that kind of yellow color. And so that's just we talked about one of the functions of our skeletal system was to be like an energy reserve. And so it's specifically the yellow bone marrow in our bones that houses a lot of the fat cells, the adipose tissue, and so that's where lipids are stored. So those can be used if needed by the body for energy. So we call it an energy reserve. All right. So that's the information about those two. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. I think so. This picture is trying to depict they've taken just the head of the femur, and then they kind of took off a section off the top of that head of the femur, and you can actually see the yellow in here. So the yellow bone marrow actually looks yellow, and then this here would be considered the red bone marrow. So it's all that like kind of soft tissue, all those cells that are inside kind of in between the spongy bone spaces, and then the yellow marrow. And then of course, if we'd follow this down, it would kind of continue on down and through the diaphysis of the bone too. So, all right. So I think a lot of people are probably familiar, or at least have heard of, like a bone marrow biopsy or a bone marrow transplant. And so that is something that typically the bone marrow biopsy is something people may have done if the doctor suspects that there's something wrong with the blood cells that are in the bone marrow. So those cells that are producing our blood cells. So they'll take a sample from the bone marrow and look at it under the microscope and look at those particular cells. So that is a procedure more for diagnostic purposes, to diagnose maybe a problem. And then a bone marrow transplant is where you're actually transplanting bone marrow from or the cells from one person to another. So that's more of a therapeutic procedure. But the thing that you have to be familiar with is the location of the bone marrow, the red bone marrow, because we're talking about the red bone marrow when we're talking about bone marrow biopsies and bone marrow transplants. So you need to know like the location of the red bone marrow. So when we're younger, we're growing, we're infants, we're making all of our red blood cells, trying to get, continue to make more and more as we grow. Then we have a lot more red bone marrow. So, a lot of our bones contain large amounts of red bone marrow. But as we get older and we kind of finish growing and we kind of, get that proper amount of blood cells being produced, we don't have to have all of our red bone marrow producing, or our bone marrow producing them. We just have certain bones that will have a higher concentration of the red bone marrow. And then the other bone marrow becomes yellow bone marrow, and it's more of a storage site for energy. So that's where the adipose tissue kind of replaces the red blood cells. So on this picture, what they're showing is by the red, they're showing where see if we can look at it bigger, showing where you can find red bone marrow in an adult. So you can definitely find it. They got the frontal bone here and temporal bones. It's probably hard to see, but you got the parietal bones, occipital bones. So you can definitely find the red bone marrow within those bones. Then they have the sternum and the ribs and the vertebrae. So those are all places where you have red bone marrow. So those places, unfortunately, are bones that are protecting vital organs. So like the cranial bones up here are protecting the brain, the vertebral bones are protecting the spinal cord, the ribs, sternum, they're protecting the heart and lungs. So it's not good to take a needle towards or into those areas, to do like a bone marrow biopsy or a bone marrow transplant. So they will look for red bone marrow in other places. And so you can see the little head of the humerus here at the shoulder. It's red because there's red bone marrow in that little head there. And then the pelvis. So this is our, all of it kind of together is called the pelvis. And then the little head of the femurs also have a, higher concentration of the red bone marrow. And then the other bones are pretty, void of red bone marrow. They mainly have yellow bone marrow in there. So that's why generally most bone marrow biopsies and bone marrow transplants would involve something in this area. There's still some vital organs, but they're not as vital, and there's a little bit more tissue space between these bones and those vital organs. So generally they'll take samples from those areas. So you should be familiar with, in an adult, which bones are going to have the higher concentration of red bone marrow. So, all right. So we will be talking about microscopic anatomy. So we're going to get into talking about the cells that are part of bone tissue. So I'll see you in the next video.